Hello, Diana.
So, hello, Shmitiratna, and welcome to everybody watching at home. So, this is a real pleasure to be pre recording this interview with Smritiratna in our various parts of the Highlands. Smritiratna is in Danacotia, and I'm in Ardnamurchan on a little break. So, the reason that we are pre recording this is because actually, at this point in time, what will be in the future, Smitirana is actually leading an Active Hope retreat at Danacotia, so can't be with us in real time.
Right, during the Tiratna Earth Singer conference, that's when this goes out. That's what I'll
Mm.
be doing. Um, when this goes out, I'll be actually busy co-leading a retreat with Sukema and Kema Siri at Dharnakotia. That's right.
Mm. So yeah, there's something there's some kind of synergy there actually, which is really beautiful. Yeah, and when we talked on the phone about the possible content for this interview, I was really interested to hear how you describe Joanna Macy's just the whole notion of active hope as genius, actually.
Mm.
And for some people watching, they might not be familiar with that with active hope. So I'd love if you could say more about what's been growing for you over the years, this long relationship with Joanna Macy's work that reconnects and active hope as where this fits for you, the harmony with Triratna's system of practice.
Mm. Yeah, sure. I'll have a go. Um, well, as a lot of people watching this might know, Joanna Macy actually studied Buddhism very deeply in her youth, and I think she did a master's. Yeah, I think she did a master's dissertation comparing Buddhist philosophy with systems theory, which is a 20th century kind of way of looking at the nature of reality. And although she studied Buddhism, she doesn't call herself a Buddhist. What she's tried to do is make the basic principles available to as wide a spectrum of people as possible. And she's found ways to express those principles outside of Buddhist terminology. And thereby, I think she's reached a very, very wide audience. Um, and when I first met I first met Joanna Macy in 1983 in London when she was over in the UK to promote her new book. And yeah, immediately made a heart connection with her. Um, and then years later, when I was increasingly troubled by what was going on in the world, I came back and started reading her again. And what struck me after revisiting it after years and years and years of studying and practicing and teaching Buddhism were the parallels that I saw between her thinking and traditional Buddhist um, doctrine, philosophy. So the whole notion of active hope means that each one of us has a choice. We can choose what kind of future we wish to envision. Now the future is wide open. It hasn't happened yet, and it's just a possibility, many possibilities. And the thinking is this, that if you choose to imagine a better world, um, and then you devote yourself to action that helps to bring that world about, then you are contributing to that particular future and making it more likely to arise. Whereas if you envision a future which is very ugly and bleak and hopeless, you're likely to despair and then just become passive. And especially if you feel you have no control over that future. And just by failing to act positively, then that future is more likely to arise. So we collectively in the present day, we co-create the future out of our actions. Obviously there are very, very many other factors, including what is happening in the environment, but we have a part to play in what happens in the future. And if we can envision a future which inspires us and which is positive, and then we actively work for that, then we make that future more likely to arise. And we can do things that keep that vision alive in our hearts and minds, and continue to act to help to bring it about. Now that kind of visioning is right there in Buddhist doctrine, because we have the Noble Eightfold Path, which is vision and transformation. So in the first stage of the Buddha's Noble Eightfold Path, you envision the ideal you. You envision a future in which you are able to be at your very, very best, that you can embody your Buddha potential. You envision a future in which you have the love and the courage and the clarity to respond to what's happening and contribute in the best possible way. And having envisioned that future, you then set about transforming yourself and your relationships so as to bring that future about. And that's the Noble Eightfold Path. It starts with vision, and then it's the practice of transformation. And in the Noble Eightfold Path, you don't just envision the ideal you, oneself, but you also envision a world. You envision how the world could be, and you decide that you'd like to contribute to that world, and then you set about transforming yourself and doing what you can to help other people open up to that too. And that's the whole Buddhist philosophy of the Noble Eightfold Path. So again, it's envisioning a future and then actively practicing to bring that about. So the philosophy of active hope and the Buddhist philosophy of vision and transformation, that they're right in parallel with each other. They correspond to one another. So I'll just hand back over to you.
Very inspiring. That you can hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah. I find that really inspiring, and the fact that you actually met Joanna in the 80s, and then you went back to her at a time for you personally when you felt you needed that. And so it seems as though personally for you, the real just the parallels between the co-creating of the future, how likely the future that we imagine will arise, whether that's positively, or if we don't work in a positive way, what will arise, and how that is just a sort of mirror of the Noble Eightfold Path, but in a secular terms, so this wider reach. So thank you for sharing that. It's making me think about the conversations that we had, and you used a phrase around this deep responsibility that we have for keeping ourselves inspired. So how do we keep ourselves inspired in order to have that vision of this future and that we can contribute to, it seems to speak to me of imagination. So I'm wondering about inspiration and lineage within Triratna, and how our devotional practices can support that, keeping active hope alive in our hearts.
Well, again, I see a strong parallels between traditional Buddhist practice as practice within Triratna Buddhist community and the philosophy and practice that Joanna Macy teaches, which is in a secular context, or rather it's in a context which is open to any religion or none, because she has her own system of practice that starts with gratitude. So and we have a system of practice too that in a way also starts with gratitude. So you see, in her system of practice, it's called the spiral of the work that reconnects. And you begin with opening your heart to what you love and what you trust, what you appreciate. And then once you've done that and really grounded yourself in that, your heart is open and you feel connected and resourced. And then you move into a phase called honouring our pain for the world, where you open up to your feelings and emotions about the state of the world and the state of humanity. And very often those feelings, those emotions are painful and confused and difficult, but that's where the energy is. It lies in our emotions. So we need to open up to our emotions and just be with that, whether we feel scared or enraged or blocked or numb or confused or fearful, whatever it is, that's where the energy is. And so in that phase of her spiral, it's becoming aware of your emotions and opening to your pain for the world. And then in the third phase of the spiral, you consider the whole situation we're in a bigger context. You see it within a vast stretch of time, and you consider it from many different perspectives that enable you to hold the present situation in a bigger context, in a very often an inspiring context. And it's that combination of mindfulness of your emotions and holding it in a bigger context. That's where I see the parallel with traditional Buddhism. Also in the fourth of her 4 stages of the spiral of the work that reconnects is the going forth, where having gone through the whole spiral, you feel that you have renewed yourself and you feel that you can rise to the challenges of our time and face them with a new courage and a new vision of what the world could be. So you go forth into the world and you have another go at responding positively. Now, in traditional Buddhist practice, for a Buddhist, you wouldn't start meditating until you had opened your heart to what you love and trust, what you feel grateful for, because you might remember the Buddha, remember your teachers, remember the lineage. You might think of images of humanity at its very best, an image of an enlightened humanity, the Bodhisattva, and you remember your friends, the spiritual community, and all of that is gratitude practice, and it enables you to feel really grounded in your context and resourced by it, and crucially it opens your heart. So this is what gratitude practice does. It opens your heart, and human beings cannot respond to the challenges of life well unless they respond wholeheartedly. And then, unless they respond with a wide open heart and a sense of connection and openness, real emotional openness. It's when we contract into intense fear or hatred or intense kind of self-obsessive craving or preoccupation. That's when our heart shuts down, and we're not at our best when our heart shuts down. And in traditional Buddhist philosophy, it's opening your heart to what you love is crucial. That's seen as crucial. And we do it through gratitude, and we do it through cultivating loving kindness and compassion to the people around us. But even cultivating loving kindness has to start by opening to what you already love and grounding yourself in what you trust. So, for example, when I practice metta bhavana, the cultivation of loving kindness as a meditation, I start by calling to mind the Buddha and my community and my teachers, and I look around me and I appreciate nature, the beauty of nature around me, and that's my launch pad, really. I ground myself in gratitude. So both in Joanna Macy's system of the work that reconnects and in traditional Buddhist practice and philosophy, you start by cultivating positive emotions like appreciation and love in order to open your heart, so that you have the resources to open to suffering. And when you practice a really thorough mindfulness of your body and your feelings and emotions, there's always suffering there. So that's how Buddhist practice begins, with mindfulness and positive emotion. And it's not actually helpful to start contemplating impermanence and death and danger until you've really established that grounding in mindfulness and positive emotion. And that's right there in Joanna Macy's system. Start with gratitude before you turn to your pain. And it's also there in traditional Buddhist philosophy. Start with mindfulness and positive emotion, because before you turn your mind to reflecting on impermanence, for example. And so or in terms of meditation, you practice samatha meditation, which is calming and heart opening, before you practice vipassana meditation, which is contemplating the truths of impermanence, of life and death, and so on. There's no point contemplating our pain and the danger that's facing us until we've first established ourselves in grounded mindfulness and positive emotion. And you can see right there's a parallel between the two systems. So in her system, you start with gratitude and opening to the pain in the world, and then you consider the teachings of the wise. And she shares many of her own teachings because she is a sage. I would suggest she is a sage in her own right, although she might not call herself that. But she's also drawn on the teachings of other religions and cultures and the traditional teachings of indigenous peoples. And there you are in traditional Buddhist practice too. Mindfulness, positive emotion, opening to impermanence, contemplating the teachings. It's right there. And if you do that, then you transform yourself. And self-transformation is not an easy process, because it means letting go of old ways of being and opening up to new ways of being. It's very often like a kind of spiritual death and rebirth. And in her system of practice too, she recognizes that the process of really opening to your pain for the world can often include opening to your sense of despair and trusting the process. Trusting that if you just stay with the reality of your feelings and emotions and hold it in a positive, supportive context, there's a whole process of metamorphosis that happens within the body-mind, and something can arise out of this process that is completely new. So that's right there in traditional Buddhist practice, the concept of spiritual death and rebirth. And it's there in her system where you trust the process of opening up to your, sometimes opening up to your despair, and trusting that that's not the end. That if you just allow yourself to really, really feel that, and then let time go by, something happens. There's a sort of mysterious kind of metamorphosis that can happen if you hold your painful feelings in a positive context. Either a Buddhist retreat or a Joanna Macy workshop, or in the case of Dana Kosha, both at the same time. Because at Dana Kosha, when this recording goes out, I'll be leading a Buddhist retreat, and in the context of that, within that, I'm going to be leading a Joanna Macy workshop, myself, Sukema and Kema Suri together. So I think both within the Buddhist perspective, there's a kind of faith in humanity, really, that sometimes when you turn to your pain and confusion, and yet you're longing for a better world and a better way of being, that combination of active hope and intense longing and pain and despair is like a crucible. It's like a crucible of transformation. And over time, something new emerges. So you can see on any Buddhist retreat, anybody who's been on a Buddhist retreat is especially say a week-long retreat, is familiar with that process. You let go of old habits when you pack your bags and head off to the retreat centre. You let a lot of old habits, and you open yourself to a new context, a new environment. You listen to some teachings, you try some practices, and then you find that the old you starts to fall apart, and you feel as if you're sort of, in a way, going into a kind of melting pot, and there's a kind of inner kind of dismantling going on. It can be quite disconcerting if you're not used to it, but if you're familiar with the process, you can actually welcome it. And then as the process goes on, towards the end of the retreat, things start coming together again. You start to see your life in a new way, and then you realize that you're not the same person that arrived on the retreat. You're a new and improved edition of yourself, ready to go forth into the world with some new insights and some new inspirations. And this is very much what happens on a Joanna Macy workshop too, whether it's a 2-hour workshop or a 1-day workshop or a 1 week or a 1 month or a 3-month workshop. She's done all of them. There's a process of inner transformation whereby you go forth a stronger and clearer and more courageous and more loving person than when you arrived. So can you see, Diana, how her system of running workshops to resource people to face the dangers in the 21st century has so many parallels with traditional Buddhist practice as practiced within the Triratna Buddhist community?
See that,
Oh, yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, it's really powerful stuff, isn't it? And although this for Buddhist practitioners is not it's not new, but that opening up to, particularly with the Triratna Sangha conference and the frame, the lens that we're looking at in terms of the climate and ecological crisis. Remembering to remember, remembering that it starts with that inspiration and then bringing that gratitude and positive emotion together, that we can't do the spiritual death that so many of us yearn for. We yearn for that spiritual death. We can't do it alone, and we can't do it without that positive emotion. And I find gratitude the most amazing. Yeah, I remember hearing around that scientists are yet to really understand gratitude, having looked at the brain and looked at people, monitoring people actually going through the experience of bringing to mind that which that they're grateful for, and the whole change in experientially is so powerful. And then to have that basis to then honor our pain, bring in the mindfulness of our emotions, and hold all that within the bigger context. I love that kind of parallel with the cosmological, really, that we kind of get with the Arya Sangha, and with, it makes me think of the Sutra of Golden Light and how it's all happening, to really, really kind of zoom back and be like, wow, it's all happening. And yet we can hold all that with love and go through that process, trust the process. And on retreat, we go through that together. It's very much a collective experience, isn't it? And so that spiritual rebirth, or going forth, re-entering the world with new eyes, something very, very special. So we're resourced, as you say, to be with the world in new ways. And for me, as there's a sort of renewed commitment as well to that. Often I can question my contribution. I feel like I've got a vision, but I'm questioning my contribution towards that. So the resourcing is so helpful. And I think what happens to me personally when I can feel that I'm not resourced is that I know that I'm depleted in my connection with nature. So when I feel more separate is when almost always when I've not been able to be in nature. So that leads me to my next question for you, which is about the conditions that we find our lives in and how they can support this our ongoing transformation. We holding up that responsibility for an inspiration, the vision, continuing the transformation together. So I'm aware that you live in not unique conditions. I know you're not the only person that lives this way, but certainly very special conditions. And that these do really, really support you. I mean, when I hear about your sort of daily practice, and certainly for the morning, most of your mornings, where you live in this very low impact way, I'm human, so I do experience some jealousy around that. And I know I'm not the only person that'll be watching this that will feel that way. So yeah, I've got two questions. I guess I'd like you to be able to say more to people who are maybe not aware of how it is that you live, where you live and how you live. And then how, your advice for those of us who maybe live in more urban settings, of how we can bring that into our lives.
Yes, I'm happy to talk about that for a while. For the last 20 years, I've lived in a cabin in a forest about a mile from Darnacosha Retreat Centre in the Highlands of Scotland. And it's a one-room cabin with no plumbing, no mains electricity, no inside toilet. I'm very happy there. So I get my water from the stream that runs about 10 yards away in water carriers that sit over my sink. I've got electrical sockets that run off 12-volt batteries, big lead acid batteries, and I charge them up with a solar panel. So my electricity is free off the sun, and my water is collected from the stream. And I've got a wood stove, and I've discovered that there's enough dead wood in a forest that I don't have to chop any live trees down to keep myself stocked up with logs. I was so pleased when I discovered that. Probably any forester watching this will just roll his eyes or her eyes and think, when was he born? But actually, I wasn't trained in forestry when I went there. I just kind of got to know the forest, and I started seeing that there are always trees that in a forest, all the trees are racing upwards towards the light, and the ones that don't make it just die off. And for example, so if you've got an area where, say you've got Sitka spruce, which is evergreen, that's green all the year round, so it kind of effortlessly wins the race. And in amongst there, you've got birch trees that have kind of self-seeded. Eventually, the birches get shaded out, and then they die standing up. So I just go around looking for these birch trees, and before they fall over and rot, and in the process of rotting put their carbon back into the atmosphere, I have them for my log stack, and I burn them on the stove, and they put their carbon back into the atmosphere while they're warming me up. So you see, it kind of doesn't make any difference. So so my energy is, I just kind of harvest my own dead wood, saw it up, chop it up, burn it on the stove. And it doesn't cost anything in terms of money, and it doesn't, well, apart from a bit of petrol for the chainsaw from time to time. And it doesn't cost anything in terms of carbon emissions either, because it would otherwise have rotted. So that's my lifestyle. Darnacosha kindly provides my food, sort of cycle off down the road to Darnacosha. So I do my teachings at Darnacosha. I mean, when I lead a week's retreat, I do it for free, and they provide my food. And so that's my kind of lifestyle. But I think in terms of my own inner experience, the most important thing is that I'm living in the midst of nature. I'm living among the trees, who are my neighbours. And I see the trees around me are living beings too, and they are sharing the space with me. We're living together. And so I'm not living on my own. I'm living surrounded by many, many, many sentient beings. There are millions of us, and quite a lot of us are living inside my own body. I was reflecting on this morning, The idea of being alone is a bit nutty, really. I mean, even inside my body, there are millions of, apparently, the number of non-human cells inside a human body greatly outnumbers the number of human cells. There's a whole community in there. There's a whole ecosystem. And certainly outside of my body in the forest as a whole, there are mice and there are birds, there are beetles and there are flies and there are pine martens and squirrels, and there's a hare and there are some lizards, and it just goes on and on and on, you know. And there are many different kinds of plants and trees, and we are all neighbours and we're all living together in one big community. So I feel that as long as my heart is open to my neighbours, I don't feel lonely. At least I don't feel lonely very often. Sometimes I feel lonely for human company when I haven't been in communication for very long. But in a way, I don't feel alone in another sense. I feel very connected. And I feel as if that sense of being part of nature, not just with nature or able to visit nature, but actually I am nature, I'm part of nature. That sense helps me to feel grounded and connected and happy. And so that's how my lifestyle contributes to my life. And I know that, I mean, in my youth, I spent a lot of time living in cities. I lived in London for many years. I lived in Sheffield for a few years. And whenever I was in a city, I always found out where the woods were. And I can't really handle living in a city unless I visit the woods quite often. So in London, I used to visit Hampstead Heath, for example. And in Sheffield, there was a wonderful, right on the outskirts of Sheffield, called Willowbrook Park. So anybody from Sheffield who's watching this will be nodding their heads and smiling, I expect. A wonderful place. I used to go down there of a Sunday and take a packed breakfast with me and thermos flask and some oatcakes. And I'd arrive off the bus and I'd walk in amongst the woods, and then I'd meditate, and then I'd have breakfast. And I'd spend a lot of the day, you know, in Willowbrook Park. It would be like a kind of day retreat in the woods. I'd spend a whole day in the woods, you know. And this is me as somebody living pretty close to the centre of Sheffield, you know. So even if you're living in London or Sheffield or a big city, you can find the woods and you can go and spend time in the midst of the trees, and and you can practice, you open your heart and appreciate it all and practice gratitude. So yeah, that is where I live, and the principles on which I live and why I love it so much. So back over to you, Dinah.
Living so intimately with your neighbors like this, that's almost like a symbiotic relationship. And yeah, that collecting of and harvesting of the dead wood, I could just see the joy in your face, you know, that you didn't have to harm even a tree to support your way of life. But of course, you've got Danakosha right there, and that interdependence there too. That is really, yeah, very beautiful. And I love that there are more non-human cells than human cells in the body. Yeah, that's really wonderful. So there seems to me that it really matters that you can go at a slower pace. It really matters that you have time each day to commune with your neighbours. And even before we started this recording, that was, you know, we had a little break. We did our tech check. You had a little break and had to go into the woodland, and that's yeah, I was really moved by that. And just that reflection that we are nature. We're not separate from nature. We are nature. We think about the nature of minds, and our minds are nature. Yeah. So I have another question, but I'm just going to do a time check and ask you how you are, Smritiratna, for further questions, or how do you feel? Would you like to wrap up?
Oh, certainly not. I'm quite keen to. Um, I've got so much more I'd like to share.
Mm,
Uh,
mm.
One thing I'd like to talk about is my daily meditation practice and how that is part of how I keep myself inspired. But
Let's do that.
I expect that's on your list at
Yeah,
somewhere or other.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my next question, yeah, it ties into that absolutely. So I was explaining to you on the phone as well about how my work involves working with teachers and young people, and just this increased awareness of eco-anxiety, particularly for young people, um, and for educators to try and find resources to work with young people in that way, and mindfulness coming into schools, body-based practices coming into schools more. I find this very inspiring. And I think I was sharing with you too about how my own, just my reflections on Greta Thunberg as a young person for whom many of our young people look up to, and how she was mute for a number of years after learning about the climate crisis in school. And this was really frightening for her family. And what brought her out of that was therapy with horses, and this really deep connection that she felt. And when she talked about how her body was and what happened when she had that experience, and very deep into herself in terms of depression and the muteness, it felt to me as if that was sort of limbic hijack, like she just felt the enormity of the existential threat. And so, to use the language that we were talking in the beginning with Joanna Macy, there wasn't she wasn't supported to have that gratitude and the positive emotion before she was opening up to the suffering. So for me, that's very important that we support teachers to do that when they're working with young people. So it's a very long-winded way of getting around to this, but I know we've had conversations about the sense of urgency that we have right now. There's a sort of urgency to transform our consciousnesses, to let go of our fear, but we can't rush this process. We're in a process, and so your slower pace of life and your meditation practices every morning are a big part of that, a big inspiration to me. I find them very enlivening when you talk about that. So I would love for you to share that, and maybe with a sort of sense of how that can support eco-anxiety or horrified anxiety that we are with wider. It's wider than just the climate and ecological emergency, isn't it? We're aware of just a multiplicity of systems of oppression at the moment, and I know that you care very deeply about many of these that you're aware of. So yeah, over to you and how your meditation practice supports all of that.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I live in the woods, but I have a radio and I listen to a lot of BBC radio. I think that's my main access to the outside world, really, apart from just chatting to people about their lives when I'm at Dharnakusha. So sometimes I keep up with the news on Radio 4, and there's a lot of interesting programs, documentaries about what's happening in the world. And I'm very well aware that any media outlet has its biases and limitations, but that's true of any media outlet. I'm confident, I know that full well that the BBC is a state-run organisation and it's not necessarily going to portray anything that's too far against the government. But I'm also aware that there's a lot of pain and suffering out there in the world, not only in countries that are suffering warfare like Ukraine, but also right here in the UK in terms of people's real hardship trying to make ends meet, trying to feed and support and shelter, clothe and warm their families, And that really troubles me ongoingly. Yeah, sometimes I feel quite sort of weighed down by so much suffering going on. But I also know that it's my responsibility not to overwhelm myself with too much bad news. It's my responsibility to be aware of what's happening without overloading myself, without overwhelming myself. So I do quite carefully limit how much I take in. And I spend enough time to open to what is beautiful and to what is what I love and what's good around me. So for example, my favorite way of beginning the day is to rise early. I usually get up about, I don't know, sometime between 5:30 and 6:30. And I love that early morning time. You know, this time of year I rise before dawn, before, I mean, if you get up at 5:30, it's quite a long time before the light starts to emerge. And there's something wonderful about that time. You feel, you know, a new day has yet to emerge, and it could be anything. Anything might happen. It's all new. It's about to arise. And, you know, I get dressed and switch on the light and make some tea and do some pondering of where I'm up to in my life. And then when I get around to meditating, it's opening my heart to my teachers, to the Buddha, Dharma and Sangha, to my heart connections with Buddha mind through Vajrasattva. And then I do a mindfulness and metta bhavana practice combined, simple, open-ended kind of metta. And then I go outside and I do some walking meditation among the trees. And while I'm walking, I contemplate the 6 elements, the ancient 6 elements of earth, water, fire, air, space, and sentience. And I contemplate them with gratitude. So I start by saying to myself, gratitude for the earth, solid ground beneath my feet, gratitude for earth. And I look at it and I feel it under my feet and I feel, thank goodness for the earth, the solid ground beneath my feet. And I look around me and I see the solidity of the trees that are not falling over into a pool of goo, but they're actually standing tall and firm and stable because they have the solidity of earth element within them. And they have drawn it up through their roots, the minerals of calcium and phosphorus and magnesium, and that they've made themselves out of that, all of those things. And so have I. I've taken it in, and my bones are made out of those minerals too. So I go through the elements one by one, but I also contemplate how one day I will die and my body will fall to the ground and disintegrate, and the earth in my body will return to the earth outside, and it'll be recycled and used by other earthlings after I've died. And then I give them a blessing, you know, and I say, may you use the earth element within me and have good lives and make good use of it, just as I've used it well, and I feel grateful for having had the loan of it. You know, and I remember that phrase in the Sevenfold Puja, just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become. And I contemplate my death in this context as an opportunity to give the elements that I've been using in my body so that they can be serviceable in the body of other sentient beings after I've died. So my death is an act of giving up and also giving and sharing out. My death is an act of sharing myself out among sentient beings. So when I think of my death in that way, in the context of walking among the trees I love and really appreciating the beauty and wonder of nature, I feel happy about that. I feel really, really happy about that. That if I'm going to die, then to die by sharing myself out so other earthlings can make good use of the water and earth and fire and breath in my body. I'm actually happy because I see it's an opportunity for generosity. And when I'm contemplating the water element, I stop and stand with my feet on either side of my stream, and I gaze upstream to where I fill my water carriers. And if it's raining, so much the better, so much the better, because I actually see and feel the rain that has just blown in on the wind from the ocean, purifying itself from the salt in the process, raining down this pure distilled water, and then it's right there in front of me, washing down the hillside, into my water carriers, into my tea and through my body. What a wonderful thing. You know, we're provided with purified water from the ocean by the wind, free of charge. Free of charge. And it happens every day. Isn't that? It's like if we had to pay the electricity for huge desalinization plants, you know, then we wouldn't just have our fuel bills, we'd have our desalination bills as well. But no, it's provided by nature free of charge. So I am opening my heart to what's right about the world, what is beautiful and wonderful about the world. And rather than only dwelling on what's wrong with the world. And I think getting the balance right between those two things is really crucial. So there's plenty going on in the world to horrify you and to leave you feeling, despair and despondency. But there's also plenty going on in the world to delight you and bring a smile to your face and bring the tears to your eyes out of sheer gratitude and love. And I think in terms of everybody, when they start getting overwhelmed by eco-anxiety, remember the wisdom of Joanna Macy. Come back and ground yourself in gratitude. Don't just spend time with your pain for the world, but also ground yourself in gratitude. Otherwise, you won't be in a fit state to respond with real clarity and wisdom and courage and energy and inspiration. You have to come back to the gratitude whenever you feel the need. And also in traditional Buddhist doctrine, there's no point contemplating death if you do it in an anxious state. The best way of contemplating the death is contemplate death with love. That's what I do. I contemplate death with love. And in the process, I feel even more inspired and I lose my fear of death. My fear of death is kind of there's so much love and gratitude and delight going on around it that my fear of death just kind of like dissolves and disappears. And I just feel, well, what have I got to be afraid of? Everybody has to die. The trees around me will keel over eventually, you know. And when I die, someone else will get to live in this wonderful place. And then I feel, good luck to you. The people who will live here after I die, I hope you have good, happy lives. And anything that I'm doing now, may it resource you in the future. Another part of my Buddhist philosophy that inspires me is the Bodhisattva ideal, which envisions life in a way that includes rebirth. So the way I see it, and I love the Bodhisattva ideal, and although I don't have first-hand experience of what happens after death, so I can't really say, from first-hand experience, that there will be rebirth, but I'm very inspired by that way of looking at things, and I love the idea that I'm using my time in this life to prepare myself for future lives when I will be living amongst the people who will be, on the earth in decades and centuries to come. And I aspire to living my life now so that in the future I will be able to take rebirth amongst my descendants, among our descendants, and be there for them and encourage them and help them in whatever way I can. I envision a world in which the human race is about to go through a series of global disasters that will reduce the human population, but will not render humanity extinct. My vision for the world is that humanity finds a way of surviving all of those disasters, because humanity has the capacity for Buddhahood on this planet. And although you could say that every species has the capacity for Buddhahood, the fact that we have the capacity for imagination and communication and contemplation means that we have the best potential for Buddhahood. And the way I envision the world is that even though it's inevitable that we have to go through this transition of a lot of disasters that will probably very likely reduce the human population, we have yet to really flower and be at our best as a people, as the people of planet Earth, as the human beings of planet Earth, because Earth has generated this species with the capacity for Buddhahood, which means that this planet could be a sort of nursery for bodhisattvas, a sort of nursery for bodhisattvas who are able to live in the future at a time when humanity has found a much better way of living with each other and with the ecosystem. How they have found a way in the future where they can resolve their differences through dialogue. They don't have to fight. They certainly don't have to use weapons to resolve their differences. Where they can see the wisdom of sharing out the resources so that everybody has just about enough, and where they concentrate on what really matters, which is bringing out the best in humanity, where the whole of the human population cooperates in collectively bringing out the best in humanity, so that we collectively can generate enlightened human beings, and they in turn in their successive lives can go forth across the cosmos and seed the possibility of enlightenment in other civilizations, in other parts of the universe. So that's my vision for planet Earth, and that's why I don't want to give up on humanity just yet. Because we've got a part to play in the whole universe, as has every intelligent civilization. We have a part to play in the whole cosmos. And sure, eventually this species will become extinct and this planet will plunge back into the sun. But I just wanted to share that because, if we can see what's happening on our planet in that bigger context, I think it can inspire us not to give up on humanity. I've heard people say maybe human beings cause so much destruction on the planet that maybe it's better that they become extinct. And I say no, because human beings are capable of Buddhahood. It would be such a waste. So rather than why destroy ourselves, let's somehow keep the human race going and live on generation by generation into a future where we become a nursery for bodhisattvas that spread across the cosmos for the benefit of all beings.
Wow. Well, I'm very, very moved by that vision. Wow. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, there's something about the Dharma as well, isn't there? Like our responsibility for the Dharma that ties in with everything that you've just been describing there. So, like Joanna Macy's great turning, and I guess Sangharakshita's vision for a new society, there's something in what you're saying, which is humanity has this potential. And if we live our lives as bodhisattvas in training, we co-create that together. So our Sangha together supporting each other's bodhisattva training. It just feels to me like, what more important thing could we be doing with our lives? Yeah. I feel like we should end there, Smritiratna. I feel like we've got that was a very, very poignant part to finish up on. And I particularly loved that you had the words of yeah, I'm kind of, this is death as an act of generosity. I'm going to be really thinking about that, I can imagine, for the rest of my life, maybe. That this so may I become that which maintains all beings. There's something really in there, isn't there? So I wondered if you would I wondered if we could end with may the merit gained. if we can think, maybe how you would feel about reading that for us.
Yes, well, since we're on a Zoom call, we can't recite it in unison.
Yeah.
Otherwise it'll be all higgledy-piggledy. I just want to say that by way of bringing the call to an end, that I feel that we in Triratna Buddhist community have a real contribution to make, because it's very clear that the principles that we have learned within Triratna very 100% have application to the plight that humanity is in at this planet time in the 21st century. And if we can find a way of resourcing ourselves through Dharma practice to face up to the dangers, and then helping each other and people, at large to do that, then we've got a lot to share. We've got a real contribution to make. And I think the sense of the big picture in Buddhism of seeing what's happening within cosmic terms, within vast stretches of time, is part of that. And yes, I'm going to die, you're going to die, but that's just a small thing happening in a much, much, much huge stretch of time. And it's not the end of everything when I die. It's not the end of everything even when this planet dies, because there's something bigger going on across the cosmos. We're not the only ones here. There's, I also wanted to put in a plug for Dharmakosha and the retreats I'm leading. It's too late to attend the Active Hope for Humanity retreat because it's already started when this goes out. But I will be leading other retreats, and we're going to make this one an annual event at Dharmakosha, and if it books up well, and there's a waiting list for everyone. We'll probably make it twice a year or even more. You know, it all depends on the interest really and how many people want to come. But yeah, I'm right for it. So yeah, let's wind up in a ritual kind of way by reciting the 7th section of the puja, which very much is a reaffirmation of the Bodhisattva ideal, and a dedication of our lives for the benefit of all beings, including future generations on this planet, our descendants.
In your merits right now, thank you.
Thank you. So may the merit gained in my acting thus go to the alleviation of the suffering of all beings. My personalities throughout my existences, my pleasures and possessions, and my merits in all 3 ways, I give up without regard to myself for the benefit of all beings. Just as the earth and other elements are serviceable in many ways to the infinite number of beings inhabiting limitless space, so may I become that which maintains all beings situated throughout space, so long as all have not attained to peace.